Malcolm, how many, sorry, just remind me, how many members in ILPS again? Malcolm? Oh, I think we can go on now. Okay. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening for those joining us from all around the world. This is the fourth episode of Interviews, the webinar series of the International League of People's Struggles, coming every week now, ever since the COVID pandemic hit. My name is Bernadette Ellerin, and I am the Vice Chairperson for North America for the ILPS. The ILPS is an anti-imperialist and democratic global formation with over 400 members in over 50 countries and 6 global regions, 6 continents. And today's episode will be focusing on the situation in the United States, the COVID pandemic, and the people's response. And I'm very proud to be moderating this episode along with 4 speakers, 4 very prominent speakers who will be discussing the different aspects of the struggles of the working class here in the United States and how they have been responding to the impacts of the COVID pandemic. I'm going to start with some basic information about the economic situation in the US pre-pandemic and during this pandemic. So I'm going to share my screen.
May I mention, Berna, this is Malcolm assisting with the technical elements that for people who are joining us, there's an interpretation button at the bottom of their screen or when they touch their screen so they can choose the language. There is interpretation in French and Spanish today, and you can choose the language you would like to listen to the event in via the interpretation button. C'est juste pour mentionner qu'il y a il y a de l'interprétation vers le français et l'espagnol aujourd'hui. Vous pouvez choisir la langue de votre choix avec le choix interprétation en bas de l'écran. Okay, so that's it. Back to you, Berna. Sorry for the interruption.
No, it's fine. Thank you, Malcolm, for all of those, all that information. I'm going to share my screen right now. Hold on. Okay. Okay. So I'll start off by saying that the United States economy was already in crisis even way before the pandemic struck the United States. Some figures as of February of 2020 is that the US is in public debt of about $23 trillion. The joblessness rate in the US is comparable to that of the Great Depression years, which reached its peak at 24.9% in 1939. And but according to the Department of Labor statistics, we're at a 3.5 unemployment rate. But that is fraudulent because it does not factor in the labor force in the country who is underemployed, who are part-time, and have simply stopped looking for work. And as of the past 5 weeks, over 30 million workers in the US have applied for unemployment. And the food insecurity is also 3 times greater than it was during the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasted for a decade from 1929 to 1939, and 1 out of 5 children are not getting enough to eat. So the top industries that make up the US GDP as of now are, the top one is real estate, renting, and leasing. The second is state and local government, and the third is finance and insurance. And you can see 2 out of the 3, number 1 and number 3, these are solely relied on finance capital or bank finance, no? The second relies, of course, on taxation and the well-being of each taxpayer to be able to pay their taxes. And with the crisis right now, these industries are in crisis, and that's why the recovery that the federal government has given in the form of a stimulus package is essentially a bailout for banks and big financial firms, because they are the ones that make up the top industries in the United States. So the intensification of the crisis of monopoly capitalism by the states, in this case, the US government's neoliberal and military response to the COVID-19 pandemic, is further aggravating the long existing economic recession and devastating the working class and other exploited classes here in the US. The privatized healthcare system continues to be the basis for the uncontained public health crisis marked by austerity in medical supplies, treatment, and healthcare workers. 2, the economic shutdown vastly displaces over and impoverishes the working class. Over 30 million have been shoved into unemployment in just 1 month. And large concentrations of public wealth are funneled to bail out large banks and finance capital corporations. One result of this situation right now is a rise in consciousness and favorable conditions for organizing and mobilizing among the people. There's more awareness that the system is rotten and what has caused this problem. And there is a spike in worker struggles and strikes, actions by incarcerated peoples, large creative May Day actions, even in lockdown conditions. So this year's May Day, there were creative and online actions that respected social distancing policies as well as online actions. And there have been workers across the US who have been rising up and going on strike, including many what we call quote unquote essential workers in retail and food services such as Amazon. These are big corporations, Amazon, Whole Foods, Target, and Trader Joe's, for those who are familiar with these corporations. The workers in these businesses have been going on strike, have been rising up and protesting the system because they're being made to go to work because they are being deemed essential and being put in greater risk. So this is just my little introduction, and I'm gonna turn it to our first speaker, Miss Christine Lewis. Christine Lewis is coming to us from New York, which is the epicenter, what we call the epicenter of the epicenter of the COVID pandemic here in the US. Here in the US, we have 1.2 million cases of COVID, and 320,000 of those cases are in New York. And in the entire US, we have about 62,000 deaths, and 20,000 of those deaths in the entire country are in New York. And in New York City alone, there's already been, where Christine and I are based, there's already been 180,000 cases of COVID here in our city. So I'm gonna start with Christine Lewis. Christine Lewis is a leader, secretary and cultural outreach coordinator with the Domestic Workers United, an organization of Caribbean, African, and Latina women workers in New York. A multidisciplinary performing artist, Christine has contributed to domestic workers' rights movement for many years by encouraging culture and arts as a stronghold in her work for social justice. She organizes domestic workers on the grassroots level, encouraging her peers to bring their voice to the continuous fight for justice. And Christine is going to talk to us about her work with Domestic Workers United and the impact of the pandemic and the crisis on domestic workers here in the US. Christine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Berna. Thank you, International League of People's Struggle. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this forum and this conversation. Septima Clark and Ella Baker said that literacy is liberation. And I would start with a poem that I'd written that's called "The Price of Migration is Equal to Slave Labor." And it's a certain style of poem that's called a pantun. Cotton picking days ain't over. Madam List, grow, glow, grow. Lighthouse keeping, Walk dog, let baby be first priority. Madam list, row, glow, crow. Island woman warm spirit vex. Let baby be first priority. US dollar controls Manhattan East. Island woman warm spirit vex. Scoop shit from shitty sidewalk. US dollar controls Manhattan East. Unlike Tobago's tobacco sunny soil. Scoop shit from shitty sidewalk. Times classify ad never spell this. Unlike Tobago's tobacco sunny soil. Work never been this hard. Times classify ad never spell this. Price of migration means yes, ma'am. Work never been this hard. Baby, unrelated burden, pushed along avenue dank. Price of migration means yes, ma'am. Light housekeeping, walk dog, baby, unrelated burden, pushed along avenue dank. Cotton picking days ain't over. So this is kind of like my autobiographical poem, but it's a panto. Now today I'm going to talk about the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights and what this newly, in the last 10 years, this piece of legislation means for domestic workers today, right? Who are domestic workers? We're nannies, elder caregivers, and housekeepers, organizing for power, respect, fair labor standard, and an end-to-end all exploitation. The nation's first Domestic Workers Bill of Rights was signed into law on August 31st, 2010, marking the culmination of a 6-year organizing campaign led by Domestic Workers United, an organization representing nannies, elder care workers, and housekeepers to raise standard for more than 200,000 domestic workers in New York. The Domestic Workers Bill of Rights was the first of its kind in the United States, closing the gap in labor laws that had left domestic workers with fewer rights than other workers. Prior to the Bill of Rights, domestic workers were excluded from federal labor laws and labor protection, leaving determination of employment terms entirely up to individual employers. When the New Deal was being negotiated in the 1930s, the only way that Southern members of Congress agreed to support the labor laws that were part of the New Deal package was with the exclusion of farm and domestic workers from the right to organize as well as from the right to basic labor standards. These exclusions remain to this day, and they have shaped the lives of over 2.5 million women who work as domestic workers in the United States and who continue to be excluded from these labor laws and protections. Their work is still undervalued and not respected. The Bill of Rights, however, has changed for the most part the vulnerability of domestic workers in New York, establishing basic rights and recognition so that individuals like myself can go to work knowing we have rights and protection. How do we organize a workforce? We organize by worker to worker. We organize going through the bookstores on the Upper West Side of New York, the Tony side of the east side, east and Upper West Side, Progressive Park Slope, and meeting workers and organizing, telling them about the campaigns that we have ongoing. Workers' rights, know your rights campaign, legal clinics, legal recourse in that if workers feel that they have been given poverty wages, we are able to open and fight cases with take-root justice in New York City. The steady fight is continuous. It's never done, it's ongoing. Could you imagine that the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standard Act have excluded workers, domestic workers, from organizing? And again, we could go back to the New Deal. We understand why that is. We do worker-to-worker education where members, leaders reach out to other domestic workers in their social networking and by distributing DWU monthly letters in playground, churches, and other sites that domestic workers frequent. Through training, helping to build resumes, through the nannies training course, through Cornell University Industrial and Labor Relations School, providing domestic workers with a nanny's training certificate. We could talk about the, as Bernard talked about New York City being the epicenter of COVID-19. We talk about our workers who are going to work in spite of it, right? We implore them not to go to work. Those who choose to, it's on them. We sort of implore our workers not to go to work because we don't know. We all are asymptomatic at this point. If COVID-19 has been around since November, we're all asymptomatic. However, what we have done is, and are doing, is raising funds through a love offering by domestic workers, sort of modeling the mutual aid model by raising funds to help 75 women in our network who aren't working with a small love offering stipend to tie them over. It's small, but very significant. We continue to organize in spite of, and by the way, we formed the National Domestic Workers Alliance in Atlanta, Georgia in 2007. We are proud co-founders of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. By the way, we are working independently of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. We forge alliances with the Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, who are looking to their employers, let's say in Parks, to establish conversations of what a decent living wage will look like for our workers in our network, what that would look like, the conversation across the board with something that's decent. State Senator Eric Adams was the first to say, borough president, that is, I want my district to be a domestic worker justice zone. And in conversation with other city or state representative, is committed to identifying ways through budgeting and endorsement funding to implement zones in neighborhoods such as Parks, Loop, and Upper West Side. DW is continuing to also explore some potential healthcare options for its membership, some through states subsidized that would come through the federal healthcare reform, and another as a more community-based cooperative model in places like Park Slope. That would mean a critical mass of employers pay into a cooperative healthcare fund housed in DWU, covering workers who voluntarily want to associate with the plan. DWU is looking at this as a huge base building opportunity to get workers to commit to this movement, offering workers a perk that wouldn't ordinarily be able to get from the job site. So there's a lot of work to do. We don't have all the answers. The idea is to organize our workforce against what we have and what we don't have. Our workforce is primarily immigrant women of color, women and immigrant women of color. As Berna said before, Latino women, Caribbean women, and African women. And we are here to do the work, doing the work steadfastly from the ground up. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for that wonderful sharing. Just to reiterate what Christine said about the exclusion of domestic work and agricultural work from the labor laws here, it's because these lines of work were historically held by slaves, by chattel slaves from Africa. So up until now, these lines of work are not considered formal work, and therefore they're not recognized by the legal system here in the US for labor regulations. Okay.
That's right.
Our next speaker is coming to us from Dallas, Texas. His name is Napoleon or Nap Pempeña. Nap Pempeña is the Secretary General of Migrante USA, an alliance of Filipino worker organizations in the US fighting for the rights and welfare of Filipinos in the US and for genuine democracy and freedom in the Philippines. Nap started organizing as a student leader in the Philippines, and upon migration to the US, Nap continued organizing first among Filipino youth and students, and then among Filipino workers. He was elected the founding Secretary General of Migrante USA in 2018. And Nap is joining us today to talk about a rather an invisible issue here of workers, the J1 workers here in the United States and the impacts of the COVID pandemic on their situation. Nap, you have the floor.
Thank you, Berna. And thank you, ILPS, for inviting Migrante USA to speak. And thank you, Christine, for that sharing. Christine was talking about slavery, and in the next 10 minutes, I will talk about labor trafficking, which is also considered modern day slavery, right? So specifically through the lens of J1 trafficking, an active campaign that we have against J1 trafficking here in the US right now. Human trafficking, for most of us, might conjure specific images of people shackled and isolated in dark places. But right now, human trafficking is much more than that. It is invisible, even though it's very prevalent. We could be walking amongst, with victims of labor trafficking. The people that serve us food, the people that work in hotels where we stay in, domestic helpers and others. So the very basic definition of trafficking is that it's the use of force, fraud, or coercion for commercial sex or labor purposes to amass profits. But really, it's more than that. It's more than the act. It's right now, it is a system that is managed and organized across borders through the collusion of governments and private entities. And it's really bolstered by neoliberal policies, market liberalization, the deregulation of labor laws, among others, have strengthened trafficking to this day. Human trafficking cuts across sectors and industries, and it affects workers and students and professionals. And these are just some facts of human trafficking, especially here in the US. It's after drug dealing, trafficking is tied with illegal arms trade as the second largest criminal industry in the world, and it is fastest growing. Some numbers here in the US, 14 to 17,000 people trafficked annually to the US, 2 million worldwide, 27 million people enslaved around the world, and it's a $9 billion business. And these figures are still an undercount because, as I will explain, states today actually legalize trafficking, and so we know that the numbers are much bigger. So given the definition that we talked about of human trafficking, J1 trafficking has been occurring, and these are some of the conditions that they have been facing. For those who don't know, just to give a brief background, the J1 visa is a visa here in the US that started in the 60s. It is an exchange visitor visa here in the US that's supposed to bring in, or that's supposed to facilitate cultural exchange and exchange of knowledge. But in the last few decades, some of the subcategories of the J1 visa program have been maximized, have been taken advantage of to bring in and to expand the guest worker program here in the US. You've probably heard of the H-1B, H-2B guest worker programs that have been used as a vehicle for trafficking. Well, J1 visa is now a new face of that trafficking. And so with the closure of hospitality establishments, a lot of hospitality workers on the J1 visa have been terminated or have been furloughed. And so right now, we are organizing hundreds of laid off J1 workers. And as what Bernard mentioned earlier, the COVID crisis has merely exposed the underlying chronic crisis of this society And for that, in terms of trafficking, the mass layoff of J1 workers have unmasked that long-standing problem of trafficking using the J1 program. And so a lot of the J1 workers experience fraudulent training and internship plans. They paid, at least among Filipinos, they paid somewhere from $3,000 to $10,000 to be able to get here, having been promised to receive professional training and cultural exchange, but not getting any of that. A lot of them experience harassment and discrimination at work, being given heavier workload than their non-J1 counterparts. There's wage theft. They are being coerced to lie on documents and give false statements. And there's also harassment of families in the Philippines to force them to pay up. I mentioned that the J1 visa has 14 subcategories. These are some of the categories that are the most exploitative: the internship, the training, the summer work travel, and the teachers. These 4 categories account for half of about 300,000 J1 visitors that come in every year. And the Philippines is one of the top sending countries for the interns, trainees, and teachers. And for those that are joining us from outside the US, you might be able to spot the country as a sending country here. And it's not just here in the US. There are also parallel programs across the world in New Zealand and Australia. And trafficking is a multi-headed monster, and we would just like to show how it really operates, giving specific example for Filipino J1 workers. So the next few slides, I'll show some of the players in this whole trafficking scheme. In the Philippines, there's schools that funnel students and graduates to recruitment agencies. Their deans, boards of trustees, administrators create the policies and curriculum, and they negotiate and get kickbacks, from recruitment agencies and the government. Again, the recruitment agencies, they charge exorbitant fees from the students and their families. And they even funnel the students to acquire loans from loan sharks. They collude with officials and are responsible for other illegal recruitment practices. And in the Philippines, here are some of the biggest players in the trafficking of J1 workers. As part of the neoliberal scheme, the government also plays a huge role in allowing for the operation of these criminals, and lawmakers that are easily being bribed to continue the laws and prevent any reform from happening. In the United States, these are some of the visa sponsors, biggest visa sponsors that charge fees from the students, broker labor for host companies, and are supposed to be responsible for ensuring the rights and welfare of the so-called interns, but they failed to do so. And there are host companies that employ guest workers, and by employing guest workers, they save money from paying the proper wages, benefits, and recruitment fees that previously on previous guest worker programs were shouldered by host companies and are now being passed on to the students and workers. They also participate together with the visa sponsors in lobbying against reforms to improve conditions of guest workers. And then, of course, there's the US government, the State Department that oversees the J1 visa program that now effectively has yielded, the power, the responsibility of management and oversight to the visa sponsors. And so there's not enough checks and balances. Of the 300 exchange visitors that come to the US every year, there's only 13 offices of the State Department dedicated to ensure the rights and welfare of the J1 visa holders. And so there's really a lack of protection and oversight. And part of that is because there's not a lot of incentive for the state to do so. Lawmakers yield to big interest of big businesses. They are also bribed by host companies, to block any kind of reforms. And so for the Philippines, it's in the Philippine side, it's also because of the 4 decades of neoliberal export program that has produced millions of migrant workers to this day. From a very lean bureaucracy in the 1970s during the time of Marcos, it has now evolved to a monster, bureaucracy with departments, and now even the education department is involved in it. And so, as you can see, this monster has a lot of heads and is operating internationally. And so it's very important that we fight back, not just as a mass movement in one country, but as an international mass movement. And so towards that end, we've been organizing the J1 workers, starting with the education of their rights, doing media exposure, and to push back against the very limited definition of labor trafficking, and to push for change. And it's important to note that trafficking is a part of the neoliberal agenda, where the states play a huge role in legalizing trafficking. And so with that, then the truth is the US state and the Philippine state are some of the largest traffickers in the world. And so, and it'll take a mass movement that is multinational, that crosses borders, and a movement that doesn't just address human trafficking, but addresses imperialism, which has given birth to this scale and nature of human trafficking. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Nap, for that sharing. I'll just add that the US economy, US corporations are becoming more and more favorable or reliant on cheap migrant labor through the guest worker program, and are actually, like Nap said, the laws themselves are enforcing the continuous flow of cheap labor into the US. So just some quick reminders before we go into our next speaker. For those who are joining us, on the webinar, if you look on the bottom of your screen, you will see an icon that says Q&A. That's where you can place your questions for our speakers. We'll be having a Q&A portion when all the speakers have shared. And if you look also to the bottom towards the right, you will see an icon there with, if you click onto it, you will see different flags. We are very fortunate to have interpretation in Spanish and French available, because we are an international league, a global formation, and we have members all over the world who are joining us today. We are also broadcasting live on the ILPS official channel on YouTube and also on Facebook. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. Maru Mora Villalpando is a community organizer and undocumented immigrant mother. Born and raised in Mexico City, Maru was involved in protests and marches from a young age, supporting work stoppages and strikes. In the US, she spent many years focusing on racial justice and immigrant rights. Maru is the co-founder of La Resistencia, formerly known as the Northwest Detention Center Resistance, organizing alongside people detained at the Northwest Detention Center for the past 6 years. This is in Seattle, Washington. The group's main focus is to shut down the immigration detention in Tacoma, while gaining better treatment and conditions for all undocumented immigrants held there, and following the lead of people detained. Maro has been an outspoken activist and upfront about staying in the US after her tourist visa expired due to the successful work she has been part of. In December 2017, ICE, or Immigration Customs Enforcement, put her in deportation proceedings. Despite these challenges, Maro is undeterred and continues her community organizing work. Maro, you have the floor.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you to ILPS for the invitation, and good morning from Seattle, Washington. So our group La Resistencia works in collaboration with people detained at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. This is one of our 200 detention centers in the United States. The massive immigration detention system really began in the late 90s with the results of the amazing fight of abolitionists against the privatization of prisons. So private companies felt the need to probably look at a different industry, and they start lobbying for immigration detention, which didn't exist in the past, not at the levels that we have now, since 9/11 really was the catalyst to begin this huge industry. So in 2003, we have now changes in laws that permit this construction of huge buildings. Here in Tacoma, Washington, in 2004, the Northwest Detention Center opened with what they call beds, 500 beds, and at some point expanded all the way to 1,575 capacity. But like I said, it's just one of 200, over 200, I'm sorry. And Immigration Customs Enforcement also relied on a lot of contracts with county jails and sheriff's departments to keep people detained while waiting to be transported to other massive detention centers or just to be deported at some point. So it's important to always start reminding people that the detention system is just extension of the prison system in the US. For those of you outside the US, you might know already that the US is the country with the largest number of people in cages. The US has relied on the prison system as a result of abolition of slavery. It's just another way of controlling Black and brown bodies. The immigration system relies on criminalization. The immigration system in the US is a civil administrative system, yet it's treated as a penal criminal system. So it's very convenient because if you go to a detention center, you see everything that looks like a prison, yet we're told we're not prisoners. And one of the things that works for this system is that at least in the criminal system, you can get a lawyer if you cannot afford one, but in the immigration system, you don't get one because it's civil. You have to pay your own. So it's a perfect system to keep people detained for sometimes years at the end, and it's the perfect system to create business. Right now, as you've probably seen during COVID-19, there's a lot of efforts to release people from cages. Public health officials have said again and again, confined spaces are the worst place right now for anybody to be in. Look at cruise ships, right? Nursing homes. What happened here in Washington State, we were the first one hit in the United States with COVID-19 cases, exactly in a nurse home. We see just recently some cruise ships are still not allowed to dock into piers, right? Because they still have people that are positive of COVID-19. Yet we have this reluctance from the United States governments at every level, from the federal, of course, to the local, to release people from cages. And so what we have is this fight to get people out of this death sentence, because that's what it is. And one of the most important pieces is there's no possibility of social distance. Being in prison, being in detention, you can't choose to social distance yourself from others. Here in the detention center, where there's cameras, people reported, guards tell you to keep your distance, but you sleep head to head. You eat next to each other. You can't move tables or chairs because they're bolted to the floors. You have to wait in line to get to the shower, and you can't wait, 6 feet apart. So that is an impossibility. Guards also, just yesterday, I was outside the detention center and I saw 4 guards coming out to their cars in pairs, and they're walking side by side, not keeping social distance at all. Every time we are there, we see them outside walking, not wearing any masks. Well, we outside are told we should be wearing masks. And so if that's outside, can you imagine what is going on inside? So just to also put it in context, last year, we saw through the United States about 13 hunger strikes happening throughout the nation. And every time there's hunger strikes, people are telling you conditions are terrible. This year alone, we have had already 22 hunger strikes at a national level in detention centers. That means thousands of people going on hunger strike, asking to be released. Here on April 15, people did a SOS action. They literally spelled out SOS with their own bodies in the yard, and we took pictures of that. We invite you to take a look at them in our Facebook page. And already we have hundreds of cases being reported of people in detention with COVID-19. Just yesterday, already one person died because of COVID-19, because of ICE that refuses to let people out. 2 guards in Louisiana already passed because of COVID-19. And so what we see is that people inside are being very creative. Social distancing is impossible, so they want us to see. They send us pictures, we take video, we take audio statements, and yet ICE is still not budging. There's been a ton of litigation happening. Half of it is in favor, half of it is against, and ICE won't budge. So that tells you the kind of agency we're dealing with. This is not about law. This is not about following the laws. This is about total impunity and corruption. This is the kind of agency we're dealing with. It's just an agency that has total disregard for life. Why? Because they were built with that intention to destroy our communities, the communities of color and poor communities here in the United States. While in the United States, we have seen just very few releases, just about 600 out of a population of 31,000 detained. The UK and Spain, for example, is example. They release everybody from detention. Portugal already is working on regularization, and Spain is doing efforts to regularize people's status. In the UK, they're still looking to release people. It's not the example here. And as a matter of fact, ICE refuses to test people. We saw an example here where they actually pretended to have the test in-house and told people, yes, come in, we'll do the test. So people would go to the medical unit in the Norwest Detention Center, and the medical staff will put up a swab inside people's noses, go into a little room, come back 10 minutes later and say it's negative. They have no testing available to do in-house. So they're literally come up with the most amazing, lies to avoid responsibility and avoid releasing people. They rather have people dying in their custody than releasing them. So while all of this happens, the population has decreased. Here, so of yesterday, we hear there's about 570 people detained because of all the efforts that were done. And because we have a smaller population detained, GEO, the corporation that owns and runs the detention center, is pressuring people to keep working. So you can work inside the detention center. Forget about being outside, being detained because we don't have permission to work. While you go into detention, you work and nobody asks you for papers in there, and you get paid $1 a day. And so what we've noticing is that GEO is really literally pressuring people to do more jobs because there's less people, and they're trying to comply with the ICE and guidelines of COVID-19, and they're asking people to clean now doorknobs for $1 a day throughout the day. So again, we ask you to join our efforts. We have a hashtag #FreedomAll. Next week, we're going to start a national week of action that actually is going to go from May 14 all the way to July. So different groups across the nation will be joining us too in the ask for freedom all. And we're not asking for 1 or 2 or just the more sick or the non-violent. We're asking for everybody. Right now, nobody should be in detention. And post-COVID, same thing. We should actually work for the ending of the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency. We should abolish the entire agency, and we should start dismantling the entire detention system along with the prison system. Thank you.
Thank you, Maru, for that great presentation about the struggles of the incarcerated peoples here in the US. I will just humbly add that here in New York City, prisoners at Rikers Island are being paid very, very meager wages to dig the mass graves for the COVID casualties, so that they're out of the way. And many of these casualties, they're not given proper ceremonial goodbyes. So instead, they're just being, the prisoners are being sent to another island to dig mass graves, and the containers from the hospitals are just dumping the bodies into these mass graves. Our final speaker, oh, just a quick reminder, for those of us who are joining us on YouTube, on the ILPS official channel, you can share questions or field questions to our speakers by using the comments portion of the YouTube. So you can see in the comments section, you can add your questions there for our speakers, and someone will share the questions with me here in the Zoom. Our final speaker, and I'm very happy to introduce him, is Tom Burke, who is joining us this morning from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Tom Burke is the organization secretary for the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and a former executive board member of Local 73 SEIU, or the Service Employees International Union, a 27,000 member public sector union in Chicago. Tom currently works as a stagehand in Michigan. Tom, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm very proud to be a member of the ILPS with my organization. And as everyone on this call probably understands, our view is that the US is an empire in decline. And this coronavirus and the economic crisis has shown the weaknesses of capitalism in the US and around the world, actually. And in one sense, we welcome crisis because it's an opportunity to be more bold and to organize workers and oppressed people to take power and change society and shape it the way we want to see it. So it's a pro-people society instead of a society based on making profits for the few. So who's dying in this crisis? Well, it's mostly older workers. In the United States, African Americans are dying at a very high rate, more than double what their population is in the country. Native Americans also are dying at a higher rate than other people. And a growing number of immigrants and war veterans are also starting to die. And in part, this is because of being incarcerated, held in detention centers or in healthcare centers where they're not getting the attention they need. So as people said, this is the biggest economic crisis in the US since the Great Depression, and the unemployment numbers are about the same right now as they were back then. And before this happened with the coronavirus, we saw that there was weaknesses in the US economy. We saw the manufacturing sector numbers were down, and we were predicting for a long time that there would be a big crisis. So here it is upon us. The other thing to take note of is the previous 2 years prior to this, the labor struggles in the US had actually risen, had gone up quite sharply, starting with the Chicago Teachers Union a few years back. And the Chicago Teachers Union and my own union, SEIU, went on strike in the fall and won a big victory. It was a strike that prioritized students, families and communities, and then the teachers. And they won big social gains, not just wages sort of demands, but things like social workers and nurses in the schools and art and culture programs in the school. So it was a big victory. The hotel and restaurant workers had strikes in more than 8 cities, Detroit, Boston, most of California, and they won great gains, again, with a largely immigrant workforce. But unions are on the march. The United Auto Workers struck at General Motors, costing GM billions of dollars. A 40-day strike. It was really unexpected because GM's profits were up, but they hadn't shared with the workers. They had a 2-tier system for wages. So newer workers got paid almost half what the older union members got paid. And they also were using temporary categories for 8 years instead of saying after 2 years you had to become full-time. So big issues with the labor movement. Also, unorganized workers have been doing job walk-offs. So like Google, who would have thought Google walked off the job, 20,000 people. Lyft and Uber taxi drivers have had strikes. So there's a lot of motion amongst the working class in the US, and a fighting spirit was beginning to develop. We're trying to make sure that fighting spirit continues into this crisis, because we think it's the only solution, that more struggle is what's going to make gains for society as a whole and for workers in particular. But the ruling class, Wall Street, is coming down hard on us, and they have plans. They gave themselves $1.5 trillion, the Wall Street and the banks, through the Federal Reserve, while workers are getting a little boost in unemployment and a $1,200 check from Donald Trump. There's a big crisis where people are lining up to get food at schools and other community centers because they're not able to get unemployment. In Florida, if you try to apply, it's nearly impossible to work the system. The system was redesigned so it made it difficult to get unemployment. And really, you need a master's degree to figure out the process and get the money sent to you. So in some states, it's really difficult. In other states, like Michigan, it's more possible. But while we're doing this, we see the shock doctrine kind of capitalism, where companies like Amazon are making billions in profits. UPS just reported almost $1 billion in profit for this first quarter. And how do they do it? They do it by treating their workforce poorly, even though they have a union. The problem is the union's leadership is hand in hand with the Wall Street leaders. They don't really want to fight for what's right. They won't fight for masks. They won't fight for sanitizer, and they won't fight for social distancing. So the workers have to do it themselves. They have to make the union their own. And there's been many protests around this. You can read about it in our newspaper, Fight Back News. Other sections of the country, like here in Michigan, there's been these back to work protests by right-wing people. And they're pretty crazy. They fly Confederate flags. They put swastikas of the Nazis on their signs. And the rich in Michigan are funding the Republican Party, the DeVos family in particular, who owns Amway. The brother of Betsy DeVos is Eric Prince of the Blackwater private mercenary company. And what they're doing is they control the Republican legislature to oppose the good policies of the Democratic governor, who says we need social distancing, we need to close down vast sectors of the economy and stay at home to protect each other, and we need to take care with the science and promote science. So they attack her in the legislature. At the same time, they organize these protests outside with armed thugs showing up to demand that we open up the economy, because they really don't care about anyone except themselves and making profits for Wall Street. So it's the rich who are running these little protest shows at state capitals. There's not very many people who turn out to those, but they get on all the news media too. Their targets are Fauci and scientists. Their target is China, to blame China. And their target is to blame the workers themselves for not wanting to put their lives in danger. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the fight back, because unions are doing a better job than they've done in years, and unorganized workers are fighting. They're organizing themselves. So you have healthcare workers who have been really impacted and have died. Their demands are for PPE, for mental health assistance. And you can see videos where nurses are facing down these right-wing fanatics in our capitals. Teachers, many teachers are working from home now. They're assisting students who are isolated. Perhaps they've lost family members from COVID-19 and they don't really have any other support than their teachers. And then they may have no income in their households or no food. So teachers are working through video conferences and phone calls to help these students, young students too, and their families to obtain basic needs like food. Many families can't pay their rent now, and that's another demand. But it's not just the landlords. We have to target governors and mayors with suspension of paying rent demands and not delaying it. Because if you don't have the money to pay your rent now, you're not going to have it in 3 months either. The meatpacking industry, that's a big thing in the Midwest. Greeley, Colorado, Green Bay, Wisconsin, you have big infestations of the COVID virus because people are forced to work side by side in these meat plants, killing animals. But instead of protecting them, Trump has called to use the War Powers Act, the War Production Act in particular. He didn't use it to protect people with PPE, but now he's using it to protect the profits of these meat companies. And those companies are killing off their livestock so they can increase prices. They're trying to create a supply crisis to increase their profits. Hotel workers and people like myself who work as a stagehand, mass layoffs, lots of immigrant workers in the hotel industry and the restaurant industry. They're not going back to work anytime soon. I'm being told it might be January till I can go back to work. I'm getting unemployment, but what happens when that runs out in July? We have to have unions demanding that we keep getting an income, that we keep getting paid, and that when we do go back to work, there's social distancing of 6 feet, and that people have to wear a mask as a law. If you go out, I was in the post office here the other day, and a young woman came in without a mask on. The other 7 people were 6 feet away from each other while we waited, and we all had masks on. The workers who are union, they kicked the woman out, and everyone cheered when they kicked her out. So that's what we need more of, not less of. The construction industry is going to be hit because it's housing and big buildings, and there's not many people working there yet. The postal workers are under threat from Trump now. He wants to shut them down and do away with their, the postal worker predates the US government, and they're trying to get rid of it. And he's using this crisis to do it. So I'll keep it short at that. What are our demands? We need our union leaders to actually lead our fights. We need widespread testing for COVID-19. It's not happening. As other speakers said, they lie about it. It's available through universities. My wife actually works on this, and they have a test that they could do 50,000 a day in her one laboratory. But the government's stalling on it. The FDA is stalling. Trump and Pence are stalling. That widespread testing will save lives now, and it allow us to reopen sooner, not later. But Trump and Pence, they're prioritizing Wall Street and profits. We need workplace safety enforced, and workers have to demand it, and unions have to be on front. They need to do work stoppages to make these happen. We need hazard pay. People like the UPS drivers, they need hazard pay. Nurses and doctors and other healthcare workers, they're our heroes. Well, let's pay them. Don't throw them a pizza party, give them the pay they need. We need to release all the detained immigrants, and Freedom Road was one of the first groups to demand the release of prisoners. We need to release prisoners who've been tortured by the police in the past, and we need to release all the nonviolent prisoners. And this helps the people who have to work in the prisons too. Finally, we demand that Trump quit blaming China. Trump has to take responsibility for what he didn't do. The Democrats need to get on it and take responsibility when they didn't speak out early enough. And this is a real crisis. It's systematic. We should try to lead struggles and be creative. The car caravans are one answer to that. There's other protests that we can do where we social distance. And now is our chance. You know, the dragon has appeared in front of us, and we have to slay the dragon. We have to get out there and lead the workers in struggle, lead oppressed people to a new type of society that puts the people in front of profits, puts an end to wars. Thank you, comrades, for listening.
Thank you, Tom, for that very agitating sharing. For those of us who joined us late, this is the 4th episode of Interviews, the online webinar series of the International League of People's Struggles, or the ILPS. The ILPS is a global anti-imperialist and democratic formation with 400 members in over 50 countries and representing 6 continents. And today's episode focuses on the struggles of workers here in the United States, as well as the impacts of the COVID pandemic and the people's response. And our speakers, just to review, we started off with Christine Lewis, who is joining us from New York City. She's with Domestic Workers United. She spoke to us about the struggles of domestic workers and what domestic workers are doing in response to the economic shutdown in relation to the COVID pandemic. She was followed by Napoleon Pempeña, or Nat Pempeña, the Secretary General of Migrante USA, who is based in Dallas, Texas. And Nat talked more in depth about labor trafficking in the US and how work visas, particularly the J1 visa, student internship visa, is being used by the US government to traffic and ensure a continuous flow of cheap foreign labor into the US. And he was followed by Maru Mora Villalpando, who's joining us from Seattle, Washington. Maru is with La Resistencia, and Maru is an immigration rights activist and also shared with us about the struggles of the incarcerated here in the United States. The United States has the largest number of people who are locked up in the whole entire world. And Maru talked about the struggles of those who are prisoners as the most vulnerable because they cannot practice social distancing, and the prison guards are not also enforcing safety inside these locked up quarters, and how the prisoners are also resisting and going on hunger strikes for not only for their release, but also for safety regulations to be enforced and practiced in these in detention centers. And lastly, Tom Burke, who joining us from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who is with a stagehand based in Michigan, and also with Freedom Road Socialist Organization, talked to us about the overall struggles of labor, especially organized labor, what they're doing now with the impacts of workers, and how the crisis intensified by the COVID pandemic, the existing crisis here in the US that's now been intensified by the COVID pandemic, is now laying down bare a more favorable condition for organizing and for workers to rise up and to be to raise their consciousness as well. So for those of us who are joining over YouTube, you can field your questions in the comment section. For those joining us on Zoom, there is an icon on the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. You can share your questions there. We're going to open it up now for questions. And before we open it up, I just want to add to Tom's sharing that on April 15th, the ILPS called for a global day of solidarity for public health and not for private profit. And the 5 demands that the ILPS has been and is continuing to raise is guaranteed income and livelihood, even under quarantine for all, mass testing and treatment for all, no bailouts or for big corporations, and bailouts only for working people, and social protection for the toiling masses, and respect for democratic and human rights, because we know that many world leaders right now, including here in the US, are using the COVID pandemic as a pretext for authoritarian or more fascist measures as well, versus medical solutions. So very happy to see some questions here already. I will moderate this section. Our first question comes from, sorry, I just lost it. Our first question comes from our friend Peter Murphy in Australia, and it's regarding the work visas. Peter says, we have temporary skill shortage visa, or subclass 488 in Australia, along with working holiday visa and international student visas, which contribute to huge wage theft and exploitation, similar to the work visa program here, or the guest worker program here in the US. Can you comment on this? And this is open for everyone, but maybe we can start with Nat.
Okay, Berna, and thank you, Peter, for that comment. Indeed, what we are finding out from the J1 workers is that after their 1 year stint here is finished in the US, a lot of the J1 workers try out for similar temporary visas to Australia, if they don't go there first, and so it really shows the dire situation they are in the Philippines, the vast unemployment, landlessness and corruption that leads to really crushing poverty, right? That leaves workers, especially young workers now with the J1 visa, having no choice but to keep looking for work abroad. And right now, as people have mentioned, amidst this crisis, it's the migrant workers that are being cut first, right, from businesses, and so that leaves a lot of migrant workers unemployed, and being and exposing the state neglect of migrant workers. For example, for the J1 workers right now, because they are technically considered students and interns, they are exempt from Philippine government aid that gives help, for distressed migrants right now amidst the pandemic. So that's one way that the state has been, another way that the state has been abandoning temporary visa workers. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of our other speakers like to comment or on that question? Okay, then I'll go into the next question. Our next question, excuse me, I'm just scrolling through the chat. This is a good question. This is also a time of inspiring solidarity across sectors. Can you describe examples of this solidarity, such as solidarity between migrants in detention and other incarcerated people, workers in distribution centers and fast food workers, workers in the so-called gig economy, and healthcare workers? So this is general question about examples of labor solidarity. And this is for the all of the panelists.
I can start talking about the solidarity between people in detention centers and prisons. We, as abolitionists focusing on detention, we cannot ignore the fact that, again, this is a combined effort from the United States government to keep us under control and to dispose of our bodies in case of immigrants once we're done working for them. And so everything that we're doing, it's in collaboration with people that are doing efforts against the mass prison system. So for example, here in Washington State, once the COVID-19 cases started, the first thing we did is that we realized doesn't matter how much effort we put on pressure in ICE to release people, they're not going to. There's a lot of litigation, a lot of it. And even though judges have ordered ICE to release people, they just don't do it, right? So we realized that our target should be the governor, because the governor's, it was the first state with an order of stay at home, right? And then they ordered non-essential businesses to stop operating. And so we targeted him and the public health department. We asked the public health department to tell us what's going on. They should have known, and they brush us off. They said we were wasting their time and everybody's time because they have, quote unquote, no jurisdiction. So they're really in collaboration with Geo Corporation and ICE. They believe Geo Corporation and ICE. They don't want to believe people in detention. So both the sector, the different organizations that work on releasing people from prison and us combine our efforts to target the governor. So in the case of the Department of Corrections that manages prisons, our sister organizations file lawsuits against the Department of Corrections. We had plaintiffs for legal organizations to file lawsuits against ICE. Our lawsuit was lost, theirs was won, but then the Supreme Court actually agreed with the governor because a couple of victims came out public saying, we don't want those people to be released. And so the Supreme Court agreed with them. And, that shows you the level of fight that we have in our hands. for us, for immigrants, it's a little bit easier, the fight, because a lot of people play this game of the good versus bad immigrant. You know, they're asylum seekers, they're good people, but then everybody else is not. You know, and for the prison system is, oh, they're violent, only let the non-violent out. So we as both the immigration and the prison abolition come together saying, no, we're not gonna let anybody out, you know, we're gonna fight for everybody. Everybody in prison is also a human being. And we have to revise how the prison system is operating and why we have accepted the prison system as the solution for problems. So that's the way we're working together here in Washington State, but we're doing the same at the national level. And so when our weeks of action start on May 14, we're gonna be constantly bringing that back into nobody should be in detention, nobody should be in prison. That's why our hashtag is free them all, and we mean all. And the last week in July, when we do our final push for now, we're actually gonna focus on decarceration efforts in combination, because here, for example, the Department of Correction sends people in prison to immigration detention. So it's all connected, and that's how we are trying to combine our efforts.
Thank you. Would any of the other speakers like to answer the question about examples of labor solidarity?
This is Tom Burke. I would. There's a number of different protests. Many of them center around workplace protests where, you know, on the job union workers simply hand out leaflets, something a lot of people are familiar with, and talk to their fellow workers about health and safety on the job and trying to get hazard pay. And in some cases, this has worked quickly. In other cases, the companies are stubborn and the union leaders need to negotiate instead of just doing, you know, publicity efforts where they act like everything is fine. So from the rank and file, this movement is rising. In some cases, you have like the car caravan protests, which are growing around the country. So in Chicago, there's Cook County Jail. You have 200 people who decorate their cars with slogans and go out and drive, you know, together in a caravan all around the city and around the Cook County Jail, demanding improved conditions for prisoners, release of the nonviolent prisoners. And they also tie this to the workers there who are also getting a high rate of infection. Likewise, in Minneapolis, there's an example where they've targeted ICE with a car caravan protest and specifically putting demands on the government and on the politicians. What's coming is that there's a financial crisis at the government level. And that's why Mitch McConnell, the senator from the Republican Party, is calling for states to declare bankruptcy, because then they don't have to negotiate with unions and they can start seizing the pension funds of workers. And so what we have happening now is going to only intensify, and we're going to have cutbacks and austerity at all levels of government. Some universities will probably not reopen ever again. That's what we're facing. And so there's a need to get our message out and to have a rising level of struggle that makes sense to people. You know, in my neighborhood, I see a lot of houses doing things where they put little hearts all over the windows, or they put up signs thanking the delivery workers and the emergency workers. And this is actually another form of struggle. It's quite pleasant to see because people are decorating their house with their kids in a time of crisis. But it's actually part of the message: keep each other safe and thank the workers, because that's who, it's clear now that that's who makes society run.
Let me just say, from a domestic workers united standpoint, is keeping our community in the know with the mayor's office, Department of Consumer Affairs, partnering with mutual aid to give support to workers who are on the ground, who aren't working. So it's a continuous effort with communities across New York City and our communities. Yes.
Thank you. You know, we have more questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So if your question was unanswered, I encourage to field them via the Facebook, the ILPS Solidarity Facebook, and we can direct those questions to our speakers and respond and ensure that you get a reply to your question. So I'm going to just do one more question. This is for everyone, but initially to Tom. This is, how is the US left responding to the situation of the COVID health crisis in the US? Have they chosen to be silent yet? Or are they with the people, helping, encouraging, and putting forward the people's demands and agenda to the government? And this is for everyone, but this was initially directed to Tom.
So I think most people who are active are, most trade union activists, most community activists like the others on this call, people who are organizing in different sectors, whether it's students or immigrants or women's groups. They're all active. They're all doing what we're doing today, talking to each other on video conferences and trying to figure out how to respond. Some of it's as simple as writing letters to senators and placing demands on Trump and Pence. So there's a lot of different ways to respond, but I think we're seeing initially that there is a protest movement. It doesn't get much coverage in the mass, corporate media. If 5 right-wing guys show up with guns at the state capitol, they'll be on the news all day. But if we do a car caravan with 200 people in Chicago, good luck seeing it in California, So the bourgeoisie is trying to stifle us. They are going to act in more repressive ways than they have in the past. That's what we can expect. But we have to be determined and we have to act soon. The crisis is upon us.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to reply to this question or have any final words before we wrap up?
This is Maru. I don't know, when people say the left in the US, I'm kind of, who's the left? I mean, we are, but who else? It's kind of hard to, pinpoint the left in the US. But just with that, I think that COVID-19 has, exposed the systems as they are, very oppressive, built intentionally this way. But within the left, I think we also need to recognize that, we still face a lot of patriarchy, machismo, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia. And so even those that come out and say, we're going to support everybody, you can still see them picking and choosing. And justice is not just for a few, right? We can't come and say, justice for my group, but not for yours. And we have seen that in some instances, especially in our case here locally with groups that have elders that still have a hard time understanding, what a trans person is. They still don't want to even use, to identify your pronouns, kind of that. And I think for us that's important because as we know clearly who our enemy is, so in our fight, ICE is our enemy, and we tell people in detention all the time, nobody's your enemy inside, only ICE, because ICE made the decision to keep you there, right? But the way the system is set is that inside they're going to create divisions because the worst thing that can happen to ICE is for you to unite. So same thing with us outside. The worst thing that can happen for the powers that be is that we unite. And so there's still all these class issues, racial issues, gender issues that are at play. And I really hope that the left, whatever that means, comes together into an honest, direct conversation that we still need our comrades that are identified as cis males to understand the level of power they have over people like us that are identified as cis women, especially women of color, and trans women X, and other genders.
Could I insert this before we leave? I want to leave you all with this. The Women of Domestic Workers United, we ought to be commended for weaving 3 of our era's most important movement into one. The first one is a women's movement striking out at the stigma against household labor as women's labor, and therefore not really labor at all. The second one is a women's movement defying notions about what kind of workers can and should be organized. Third one is an immigrant movement, melding the struggles for rights here and with the struggles of rights abroad. Thank you.
Nab, did you want to say anything final before we wrap up?
Yeah, just want to say thank you again for this opportunity, and on behalf of Migrante USA, we're looking forward to building the anti-imperialist movement, working class movement here in the US with you all.
Thank you again to all of our speakers for making time to share with us this morning. This is an ongoing webinar series of the International League of People's Struggles. I just want to also share that the impetus for the topic today is because each of the speakers could share experiences of different segments of the working class here in the US. And if anything, that's the main thing we want to share, the experience of the class itself, which cuts across genders, sexuality, nationalities here, immigration status. If anything, what binds us all together is our class and our class exploitation in this crisis and in this period, and the struggle of our class to bring about a new society. So that is the spirit of this webinar series and of the ILPS, to bring about the voices of the working class forward. And I can tell, I think it's safe to say that here in the US, we have a lot of uniting to do of that class, of the working class. There's a lot of unification that still needs to be done, unfortunately, because of divisions of the ruling classes' attempts to divide our class. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Malcolm for some announcements coming from the ILPS. Malcolm Guy, again, is the International League of People's Struggles Vice Chairperson for External Affairs, based in Montreal, Quebec, Canada.
Thank you very much, Berna. Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to wrap up by saying we will be holding another interview session next week, looking particularly at the situation in the Asia-Pacific area with a concentration on the Philippines. So invite everyone back next Thursday morning or evening or whatever time it is in your area, but the same time next week for a look at the situation in Asia-Pacific and particularly the Philippines. And also wanted to thank our interpreters, Marie and Veronique, today for the interpretation towards and from French and Spanish. So back to you, Berna.
I think we are finishing a little bit early for this episode, which is not a bad thing. We're so disciplined with our time. The workers here in the US are so disciplined with our time. That's a joke. I have nothing else to say. I think I want to thank all of our speakers. And for those who want to learn more about the ILPS, you can go online to our website, ilps.info. It has many of our statements, our organizational structure, which is composed of, I believe it's 17 commissions on different issues and that people are struggling over all over the world. And we do have regional formations. We do have country chapters and regional formations. Here in the US, in North America, we have 2 country chapters, ILPS US and ILPS Canada. We do have country chapters in other parts of the world. We do have a global, we do have an ILPS Latin America regional formation, as well as country formations within Latin America. We have an ILPS in Europe. We also have an ILPS Philippines chapter, an ILPS Asia Pacific, and ILPS Oceania formation. So, and our the region where the ILPS is growing the most is in Latin America and in Africa and West Asia. So those areas have also been focused, the topics of other previous episodes of this webinar series. So that is it. Thank you everyone for joining us. And again, please visit us online at ilps.info, visit us on Facebook, and visit us on YouTube, ILPS official channel, where this episode and other previous episodes are also recorded and streaming. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.
Are we off? Are we off the air?